All right, we have been looking at this concept of the Christian principles for dealing with life, and specifically how Jesus approached the Ten Commandments, or the Old Testament, broadly looking, and how the primary premise of what we're looking at is that Jesus was not fighting against the Old Testament. It had a flaw, a huge flaw, didn't it? Does anyone know what the fault, the Hebrew writer says, with the Old Testament was? A huge problem. No forgiveness of sins, or no total forgiveness of sins, Jerry says. Absolutely. I mean, that's problematic for us, right? And also, it's not so much the direct fault that's addressed in Scripture, but it had a problem for you and I as well, right? Jerry nailed the big one I was looking for, but the other one is it was a law given to the Jews. And we're going to look at a passage concerning that this morning. So we as Gentiles are included in God's will, included in His will and purpose. I'm looking for in the New Testament. But having said that, the Old Testament was by God's design, and Jesus, while He changes the old law, in fact, Colossian writer says that He nailed it to the cross. He was not in opposition to it. And a few weeks ago, we looked at the fact that Jesus stated in the Sermon on the Mount that, do not think that I came to abolish law, I came to fulfill it. So we're looking at the congruency, the agreement of that Old Testament law with the New Testament. And in short, I think, in my mind at least, what the Old Testament does is that He is... it lays the foundation, on which Jesus expands. The Old Testament was a law. God's will and desire is not for you to obey a law. It is for you to give Him your heart and serve Him with your all. Almost rhymes, doesn't it, Mike? Not technically, but it's close enough for me. So, Jesus brings it from the law to saying, here's how you give your all. And so, with that, last week we looked at the first law of the Ten Commandments, the first commandment. What is that? Here's some whispering. No other gods before me. One God. And one way that the Jews saw that, and they would repeat it, is God is one. By the way, we'll be in Exodus 20 where these are found in just a moment. We looked at verses 1 through 3 last week. One God. We also then went to Matthew 5 and 24 and saw Jesus said you can't serve two masters. He made the law relevant for the people of His time. Well, the second law, what is it? Can anyone tell me? What's the second commandment? Very similar to the first. It's different. No. It's very close. It's one. No other gods before me. No idols. No graven images is the second law. So let's go ahead and look at that. If you're in Exodus 20, before we do that though, any questions or comments on that little overview or review? Okay, let's look at verses 4 through 6. Would someone read that from Exodus 20, verses 4 through 6 for us?
likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Ye shall not bow down to them nor serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children of the third and fourth generations of those who hate me, but showing mercy to thousands, to those who love me and keep my commandments.
Okay, thank you. Here is the second commandment. You shall have no graven images before me. Mike said no idols. Right?
And that's the heart of what he is saying. Now, last week we looked at this idea that there is one God, and we said on the surface it doesn't look like it's all that relevant to us. We do not live in a polytheistic culture, nor is polytheism something that's common today. So how's the first law or first commandment relevant to us? And Jesus, I think, solved that for us. He said, don't serve any other master. And the most common master for us today and in Jesus' time is physical things, right? Wealth, that of money, possessions, and the like. And so Jesus very well points out, hey, there's ways that you can have gods before me, you can have a purpose beyond me, other than, bowing down to Baal. Now, secondly, he deals with this idea of graven image, carvings. Why is that relevant? Why is that relevant to, let's start with their time. Why was it relevant to them?
The physical thing rather than praying to God above.
Okay, so let's start here, and we'll tie both your comments together, Mike. You started with no idols, right? Is how we summarize that second commandment, which is a great summary. But the second commandment goes a bit beyond that, right? I think there's a little bit of what you're saying has to do with that idea with no idols. Idolatry plagued these people. In fact, when this was written, they were carrying with them all their idols from Egypt. Secondly, while Moses was receiving this commandment on their behalf, what were they doing? Making an idol, right? Very relevant to their time. But notice that God is not saying you should not have any idols. That's an easy summary, and it's appropriate. I don't mean to say that answer's wrong, Mike. It's not. But it's going beyond that, isn't it? That's included, but he goes on to say, you shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above or that is in earth below. Here's what the commandment's saying. Don't make that idol. And Mike, at your second comment, really, I think, was getting at this idea. You're praying to this item rather than God. Don't even make anything to represent me. That's included. Don't make any carven images to represent me. Now, I'll share something with you, and I don't know how accurate I am in this, or if this is appropriate for me to feel this way. I use all kind of pictures on my slides, right? And typically my pictures are meant to bring something to your mind that enhances what's being said. There's one thing I very much hesitate to use a picture to represent, but you can guess what it is. God, right? How do you represent God? I do use pictures like that sometimes, though. Typically has something with light, right? something to bring the concept of God to your attention. But here's the problem. We as people need things to represent so we can associate. Right? Go ahead.
God created his own image in everything that we see, so we shouldn't have to make idols, because if you need, like if you pray to something, you look out the door, you look at the sky, you look at the trees, you look at people, and like by making a graven image, you're taking away from what he had made.
Yes. So I think it's worth noting that we, the people, are God's image bearers. We're meant to be God's image bearers. But where we completely agree, where I think you are spot on with Scripture, is this idea that no matter what we make to represent God, we are diminishing him. Right? I'm not even able to make anything equal to myself. Anything I make is lesser than me. And God is far greater than me. So I think, great point, that there's an underlying principle that God is greater than anything we could use to represent him. Right? Great point. Since we're in that underlying philosophy or idea of the law, does anyone else see another underlying principle of the second commandment?
They have that image of Mary. And they believe they go to Mary too. Well, that's an image that they're trying to, a graven image, or instead of going to God, So that's wrong.
Yeah, and I'm much more prone to look at us. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so any graven image is
wrong.
Right. I think, let me ask you this, Bob, because you point out a specific group of people. Is there any way that we violate the principle of this command? Because that will get to the question I just asked. I know I'm putting you on the spot.
Yeah, if you value your car or whatever you have above, and you put that first, that would be making that a graven image to yourself and then taken from God. God gave it to us.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Is that what you're trying to?
That's part of it, yeah. It's not exactly where I'm going at.
Jealousy.
Jealousy?
That's what you're looking at, isn't it?
Not quite. Not quite. I'm getting at the underlying principle.
These are both good points, right? Okay, absolutely. And that very much is what that first commandment's about. What is God? Spirit. You're going to John 4, right? That's where we're going to take this in a moment. Is to John 4, 5 through 26 with Jesus at the well. One of the principles, underlying principles of this, and I think, Bob, this will directly address where you were going, is not only anything we make below or diminishing God, but God is not physical. He is a spirit. Now, what exactly does that mean? That's a little bit beyond our grasp, I think. We can know a lot about it, right? We can know a lot of what it does mean. Can we completely understand God in that aspect? No, right? That's why he's God. But God is a spirit. So the second commandment is not just do not have any idols. It is don't make graven images that represent anything in heaven, anything in earth, anything in the waters or anything in the waters under the earth. Now, that gets a little bit, that waters under the earth gets a little bit to the mindset of the Jewish nation at that time and how they perceived things to be physically. But the principles don't make an image to represent anything. Why? Because I'm a spirit. Don't tie me, don't diminish me to a physical representation. I'm beyond that. Here I think is one other, on any issue, or any comments or questions on what I've said so far. Aha, great point. Again, you get, all these are getting to the idea, any representation of God is a diminishment of him, right? Idols are dead, God is living. Now, how many of you have some kind of object that reminds you of something much greater than the object itself? Not ask how many of you, a couple hands up, not ask how many of you have graven images. It's not the same thing. There are similarities I want to draw on. So the question is, how many of you have an object that represents something much greater than the object itself? Few. What was that? Yeah, I think that's the answer. And some are, some of us sometimes have paralytic arms. And then others, we haven't got our minds quite wrapped around what these objects could be yet. You know, they're thinking, man, Mike's talking very hypothetically. What's and symbolically, what's he talking about? What about picture of a loved one, deceased loved one? Doesn't have to be deceased, right? That's an object that represents something much greater, right? That they become precious to us, these objects. Now, do not misunderstand. I'm not equating those to graven images. Here's what happens with those objects. I once got a call about after one of our horse shows that said, I lost my grandmother's angel. Can you find it for me? I'm not even sure how to look for an angel, right? Now, please don't misunderstand. I'm not mocking it, but I'm telling you what my thought process was. Literally, I'm like, how'd you lose an angel, right? I was going very literal, is where I was going. And how do you look for an angel? And what do I do when I find an angel? What it was a little glass globe with a representation of an angel inside that globe. It had great significance to that person. Now, you're probably wondering, where's Mike going? Is he being critical of that concept? Here is my point. Our allegiance, our loyalties, very easily are shifted and put in things, right? When we're talking about a loved one or something, that's okay. We understand it's representative. It reminds us, right? Smells, songs bring back all kinds of emotions that remind us. But when it comes to God, can you see the problem of once you have an object that represents something greater, very subtly at first, but very significantly in the end, our loyalties shift. The Israelites, I think, made this subtle yet important shift with the Ark of the Covenant. Right? Their faith, their confidence ended up being in the Ark of the Covenant. I think it's some of the underlying principles of this commandment. The reason those are important is that's what's going to enable us to make it applicable for us in a few moments. Questions, comments? Okay, go ahead, Mike.
What you're saying is like, say I did have a picture of, say, Jesus. I rely on that picture more than thinking the greater of the separation between the two. Like, I'm praying to this picture instead of praying to something greater that I couldn't even possibly imagine. Yeah.
Yes. Yes, I think that's where Bob was going earlier too, right? Mama had this picture. Now, I thought about pictures of Jesus, right? I could do that real quick. I could Google and put a picture of Jesus up here. I think the picture of Jesus illustrates, I'm not saying that classical picture of Jesus is sinful,
But I do think when you are pulling that picture out, every time you pray and praying to that picture, that's exactly what this passage is talking about. So let's look at this. What is the most, there's a lot we don't know about Jesus' appearance, right? Is there anyone here? It's a bad way of asking it. Let me ask it this way. Do we think that that picture is even possibly accurate? Nobody knows what he looks like? You're absolutely right. But I am 100% certain, in my mind, not saying you have to be, but I am, that there's not even a possibility he looked like that. You know why? Yeah, he was painted by a white man. Jesus wasn't white. You know what people look like from that part of the country? His skin's as pale as Amanda's. I say Amanda because she's the redhead, you know. She's even paler than me, right? Jesus would have fried. He would have roasted away. So here's my point. Not that I'm being overly critical of that picture, but the inaccuracies start to abound the moment we start making images. I think some of you are questioning whether Jesus was white or not. That's a geographical situation.
What's your thought about a crucifix or a cross?
Oh, there's an interesting question.
So I'll give you my opinion, and that's how the...
But a reminder.
Yeah. Now,
Chris bought me this wallet because I was jealous of the real sleek wallet, because I always had bigger leather things that, you know, make you feel like you have a bit more than you actually do back there. But my wallet before that, I say that, had a cross on it. Right? I bought in a Christian bookstore, and I was rebuked on more than one occasion by people who saw that cross based on this very issue. For me, when I bought it, here's my thought process. What better concept than to be reminded every time I pull my wallet out what my priorities ought to be? Right? That's my thought process. It bothered some people, in which case I'd tell them, well, don't buy a wallet like that. You know? But I think we're getting very close to this idea, Ernie. And I think caution would need to be used. Where that line is, I'm not certain. But when anything becomes an object that I am using to focus my attention to God, I think we need to be very cautious, and I think we're getting into that territory. Necklaces are, it's a great example because jewelry is all over, right? J.J. Johns is his name, has great illustrations. And he uses an example of asking a lady, why she's wearing a symbol of crucifixion or execution. I think there's a something that reminds us of our loyalties versus something that we're using to, hold. Mike and then Stephanie.
I was just explaining to it, like, by a person from the Church of Christ, that when you wear a cross or if you look at a cross and stuff like that, like, it's almost like say he died from lethal injection, a hypodermic needle or whatever, would you wear that on your chest? That's always why I was told about, not the crosses.
Yeah. Yeah, and that I understand both sides of that.
It's not something glorious, it's something shameful, but it is our symbol of victory. That cross is our victory. I'm not saying symbol is engraven image. I'm saying whether it's physical or intellectual, that cross is our victory. So that's why its war is jewelry, not because of the execution, but because of the victory. So I'm just acknowledging both sides of that idea. Okay. Stephanie.
I was just going to mention, what about the example that you are showing maybe just to, like, anyone you come in contact with? It might be straight, like when you're wearing a shirt, or if you have like a faith saying, or if you're wearing a cross, like a bracelet or a necklace or whatever, like the positive things that can come from an example of, like, they're like, oh, but you might get a conversation started from that, or, oh, are you a believer? You know what I'm saying? Like, I guess I've always seen it as the difference between worshiping the object versus a reminder to yourself and maybe others of what your priorities are.
Yeah.
Let me put a cautionary note with what you said. The idea of worshiping one God is in the first commandment. The idea of craving images is in the second commandment. So that we are forbidden not just from worshiping the image, but from having images that represent God as well. So, in my mind, and here's where I probably frustrate a lot of people. I don't think that I can always tell exactly where someone else crosses a line of okay to into sin. But here's the caution, and here's where I take comfort in being willing not to do that. If you ask 5 different people where that exact line is, you're going to get 8 different answers, right? So who's you going to listen to? Here's my point. Let's look at the principles. And I think God has faith in people. That when we're serving Him, we're going to follow after Him, come to the right answers. And I've got to have the same faith. So my response to you, Stephanie, would be, just like I mentioned in my old wallet, that was a reminder of what's important to me. It doesn't represent Jesus. It doesn't represent God. It's a reminder of a historical fact. It takes my attention. That sets my priority, or it makes an example to someone else in your example. The moment I think this object is focusing or harnessing my spirituality to get to God, is in my mind where we've crossed that line from a reminder to a graven image. When I start praying to something, when I start turning my attention to something to go to God, in my mind, that's where the difference is. Go ahead.
I ran into a lot of people, they wear crosses on their saddle, on their jewelry, and they actually put their faith in, they think they're saved because they wear a cross and they live ungodly lives. But they take great comfort knowing I got a cross with me. So they're actually putting all their faith in wearing that emblem.
Very much like we talked about the Ark of the Covenant, right? Yeah. Which the Ark of the Covenant was ordained by God. And Ernie, you mentioned wearing a cross earlier.
And, my question would be, I don't think you really even wear a cross, do you? That was a joke, I thought. But is it wrong to wear a cross? Are you wearing it to remind yourself? Are you wearing it to be an example? Or do you think that cross has some kind of power that God is going to protect you because you're wearing that cross? If the latter's the thought process, then there needs to be some reasoning from Scripture that's addressed there. Right? Here's a scary thought. I don't know how much you agree with what I've put forth on the principles of this, but this is very much where I found myself sorting through the Scriptures, which I think the Pharisees could not see at all. Could you wear a cross and it be sinful? I think absolutely. Could you wear a cross and it not be sinful? I think absolutely. What did the Pharisees want? Is it sinful to wear the cross or not? Very different ideas. God wanted their hearts. Questions or comments? Here's a question for you. Is the cross or the resurrection the victory? Resurrection? Both? In my mind, the cross is representative of the whole event, right? The resurrection declares the victory. No doubt about it. But that resurrection is important because Jesus gave his life for our sins. Right? The two are each needed. It's easier to be reminded of the event through the cross. I think that's why it's popular, is what I'm saying. Versus. Okay, so we got into some of the application error. What's it mean for me? Which is great, because one of the things I'm hearing is you're thinking, you're applying, you're working through there. Let's be mindful, because we don't have time to deal with it. Jesus reinforces this concept at the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman, when he says, God is a spirit. Those that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. Let me get to the application I had in mind a little while ago when I started to ask. At its heart with Jesus, and we'll look into John 4 in detail 2 weeks from now, Lord willing. And that's where we'll go next. But the question's about location, right? Am I in God's presence here? Or am I in God's presence there? I was shocked when Amanda and I got married, how many people said, "You got married outside? I thought you were a Christian." The concept that being married outside of a church building was a renouncing of my faith was completely foreign to me. Because my concept to God is not tied to a building at all. He's a spirit. There, I think, is a great application for us. To be mindful that God is not just here. I don't want to say He's not here. He's not just here. Right? In fact, I've said this at most of the weddings I've done have been outdoor. I've said this at every one. I believe God is more here with us, surrounded by His creation, than He ever could be inside of man's creation. God is a spirit. Let's make sure we're giving Him our spirit, that we're submitting to His spirit. And Lord willing, we'll look a little further into that topic next week, or 2 weeks from now. Thank you again for your time.